Welcome to Tomversations, a conversation about enterprise technology topics with me, your host, Tom Hollingsworth, the networking nerd. This month, because it's WLPC, the big wireless LAN professionals conference, I wanted to tackle a wireless topic. And thankfully, someone managed to DM me the perfect topic. You've probably heard that wireless is moving very quickly in the space for hardware. We've had Wi-Fi 6 has finally been ratified. We have Wi-Fi 6E that is something that involves new spectrum. I wrote recently on my personal blog about Wi-Fi 6 Release 2, which is the world's dumbest naming convention for things that just muddy the water a little bit when all of this Wi-Fi 5, 6, 6E stuff was supposed to make things easier. But folks, are you ready for Wi-Fi 7? That's right. It's right around the corner, geologically speaking, because we still have a lot of hurdles that we're going to have to climb over before we're ready to fully utilize this protocol. And despite what some of the people in the industry might have been telling you, including those that make hardware, don't wait for Wi-Fi 7. All right, so let's dive into kind of the status of things as we are right now. So as I mentioned earlier, Wi-Fi 6 is seeing wide adoption. And when I say that, I mean we're finally getting client devices that are really taking advantage of it, whether they be laptops or tablets or even mobile phones. Wi-Fi 6E is on the horizon. Now, as a reminder for those of you who did not watch my earlier episode about the differences between Wi-Fi 6 and Wi-Fi 6E, which we will link in an iCard upstairs so that you can kind of take a look at it. 6E is effectively all of the things that we've been doing in Wi-Fi 6, which is the protocol 802.11ax, only applied to the newly opened 6 gigahertz spectrum. All right, that's all deliciously confusing for most normal people who quite honestly aren't the people who listen to Tomversations anyway. So the short version is more spectrum available, lots of extra bandwidth. Okay, great. Well, what about release 2? Don't get into that now. That's effectively multi-user, multi-device MIMO. It's complicated. You don't need to worry about it. But there's a big problem. And that problem is the chip shortage, which we've all heard about. The Del Oro Group, which is one of those analyst firms that likes to interview a whole bunch of people, ask them some pretty generic questions, and then extrapolate some answers, basically says that one of the things that people are seeing is because of the chip shortage and because of the uncertainty around Wi-Fi 6E, a lot of people are saying, well, let's wait for Wi-Fi 7. You probably know who these people are. They're the ones that are already telling you they're waiting for the next iPhone the month before the newest iPhone is released. When you think about the way that rumor mills work, especially for hot technologies, I can remember seeing the first rumored discussions of the iPhone 14 the month before the iPhone 13 was even announced. We weren't even sure there was going to be a new iPhone. Well, we were, but we didn't know for sure. And now all of a sudden we're talking about the things that aren't going to make it into this one that are going to make it into the next one. So we're plus one technology revision away. Seems like we're jumping the gun. So according to Del Oro Group, what's happening is the chip shortage and the uncertainty is causing people to want to look and maybe wait for Wi-Fi 7, which is why I titled this episode, Don't Wait for Wi-Fi 7. I mean, let's just, cut right to the chase. But before we cut completely to the chase, let's talk about what Wi-Fi 7 is. So what is Wi-Fi 7? Well, if you are a fan of protocol numbers like me, this is 802.11be. So we have already defined that protocol. But what comes with that? Well, it operates across the 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz spectrums. So we don't have to worry about that stupid 7E thing. Okay, so Wi-Fi 7 is all three frequency bands. The theoretical speeds go up to 40 gigabits per second. That's like Thunderbolt 4 speeds. Okay, put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it in just a little bit. And remember that it's theoretical. One of the other things that you gain from this is the ability to do 16 spatial streams, up from 8 that we currently have now. And you can also do 320 megahertz wide channels in Wi-Fi 7. And I've talked about that before, but effectively think of the channel width in Wi-Fi as lanes on a highway. You have your traditional 2-lane road that sends data and receives data. Well, as you widen the channels, you gain the ability to send more traffic down those lanes. So when we get to 320 megahertz, think of that like those gigantic 10-lane freeways that you might see in some very large cities in the US, like Houston or Los Angeles. You can send a lot of traffic down those, but they take up a lot of land. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. There's some other nerdery going on, like this ability to do 4096 QAM, which effectively is like the symbol target that the Wi-Fi radio is able to hit. You can also do non-contiguous wide spectrum. That's important because there isn't a whole lot of real estate left in these spectrums, which is one of the reasons why we opened 6 gigahertz. So being able to do non-contiguous 320 megahertz channels by, say, doing 160 over here and then 80 somewhere else and then 80 in another spot actually gives you the ability to do 320 megahertz channels in anything other than 6 gigahertz. And then lastly, the important part, the final draft of the spectrum is not expected to land until 2024. All right. So that's Wi-Fi 7 in a nutshell. It's faster, it's nerdier, it is cooler. Obviously, right? Why would you give it a new number unless it was faster and cooler and everything? So why do you want to wait? Better yet, why shouldn't you wait? All right. So let's break this down because this is actually a pretty easy thing to tear apart in 2022. First of all, how many of you have a Wi-Fi 6E device right now? There better not be any hands going up unless you're a Wi-Fi nerd, because most people do not have a Wi-Fi 6E capable endpoint yet, let alone access point. There are very few companies that are actually selling the hardware to hook these up. And the reason why is because nobody's manufacturing clients yet. I mean, there are a couple that have a 6 gigahertz radio built in, or you can buy a 6 gigahertz card that will plug into your laptop. I know some people who have those, but by and large, you don't have one. And you know why you don't have one? Because 6E wasn't ratified in time to get into the latest and greatest devices. I know this because a lot of people were whinging already that the new latest greatest MacBook does not have a 6E radio. And my first thought was, what's it going to connect to? So even though we have this technology, it's been ratified, it's been approved, it's been finalized, it's been shipping, we still don't have hardware that supports it. And let's be fair, it wasn't like Wi-Fi 6 was ratified relatively quickly. I mean, it kind of was, again, on a geologic timescale. It was first proposed back in 2017, and it took 3.5 years to be finally ratified. Remember how many of those devices that you were buying that were Wi-Fi 6 capable that had little stickers on them that said draft? Yeah, we went through that with Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 4, actually, if I remember correctly. Yeah, we had a whole bunch of things that kind of worked. That was actually one of my favorite stories when the owner of my old company walked in with a draft in Wi-Fi 4 AP. And he's like, I want you to set this up in my house. I'm like, I've never heard of this before. He goes, yeah, it'll probably work. Yeah, about 6 months later, he had to rip it and replace it because it turned out it did work, but only with that card. And the final specification did not support it at all. Hardly anybody is shipping Wi-Fi 6E APs today. I mean, the big manufacturers are Cisco, Juniper, Aruba, Extreme. I'm sure the rest of the market is going to follow along very shortly. Who's shipping Wi-Fi 7? Well, nobody. In fact, only one company has shown it off, MediaTek. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So if you're having problems getting wide adoption of the current super fast technology that you have in place, why are we already thinking we need to wait for the next super fast technology that probably won't even be ratified for the next 2 years? Well, it's because people have this game that they like to play of, well, I'll just wait for the next one. When ironically enough, by waiting for the next one, you're proving the point, which is the stuff you've got right now is fast enough. Okay. I've heard the term gigabit Wi-Fi for a number of years. Oh, Wi-Fi is going to kill Ethernet because it's going to be faster than gigabit, and we can finally have the performance that we enjoy with a wired connection. Really? When's the last time you plugged your laptop into a wired Ethernet connection? How many of you out there that are in my listening audience have an Ethernet port on your laptop or have a device that allows you to put one on there? I bet you the number is actually really small. I do, but I have a very specialized use case. I seriously doubt the average person that is going out and buying a brand new state-of-the-art professional laptop has an Ethernet port. They're using Wi-Fi, and it's good enough. And you're right. you can get really good throughput on current Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6 technologies. But you know what? You're probably not using it to its peak performance. One of the things that I noticed in the spec sheet for the brand new M1 MacBook Pro laptops is that if you take their quoted numbers as the gospel truth, the radios in the new MacBooks are 100 gigabits per second slower than the previous generation. Well, when the internet found out, cue all of the crazy complaining about how the new MacBooks are slower than the old ones. And then I wrote a blog post that effectively said, you're right, on paper they are. In reality, you will never see the difference in those two speeds, because unless you are literally putting a stopwatch to it, you can't tell the difference at what you're connecting at. And remember that those theoretical numbers come from, I'm going to put in a laptop right next to the access point and configure the channels to be as wide as possible and have the least amount of interference going on. And I'm going to run the tests until I get the peak performance. Normal people don't live like that. Your access point's probably stuck in a closet somewhere. Nobody cares. All right. So let's think about that. We're squeezing peak performance out of the Wi-Fi 5 radios right now. We've finally gotten the technology to a place where it can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. We've just started off with Wi-Fi 6. That orange has a little bit more juice to squeeze out of it, if you want to think of it that way. We still have performance that we can push from those devices. So why are we talking already about how they're too slow? Well, there's this perception in the industry that after we made all these technological leaps with Wi-Fi 5, 802.11ac, that Wi-Fi 6 was kind of like this stability release, because we're used to this idea that most companies have given us of the tick-tock development methodology, which is, let's go build something really cool and cutting edge that kind of halfway works. And then the next release is going to look very similar to that, but we're going to make it work a little bit better. So that's, the iPhone is a good example of that. We're going to make a brand new one that looks cool and does neat stuff. And then we're going to make the next one slightly faster. It looks the same, so you don't have to buy all new cases, but it's a little bit more stable. And we've worked out all the kinks and the crazy technologies that kind of have work about half the time. Well, that methodology has gone into everything that we do. And so now people are like, oh, well, Wi-Fi 6 isn't ridiculously faster than Wi-Fi 5. So obviously it must be that release where they're like, oh, well, we're working on bug fixes and stuff. Well, no, actually it's not. There's a lot of things that have gone into 802.11ax that make it a better performing wireless technology, especially at the 2.4 gigahertz range, which is where a lot of IoT devices live, which we've talked about for a number of reasons. But effectively, what you're dealing with is that we have not even hit peak performance in it yet, and people are already soured on it because it doesn't have the highest number available. So I want to talk about that MediaTek demo for just a bit, because that's actually the thing that kind of got this episode started for me, is that they sent this press release out and they talked about it being the Ethernet killer. And I kind of want to talk about that. So I have a quick question for everyone out there in my listening audience. How many of your devices in your house are plugged into Ethernet? And before you answer that, I'm not talking about your firewall, your router, or your access point. How many of your client devices are plugged into an Ethernet cable? Go on. You can go count them. I'll wait. I have time. Oh, you're back already? That was fast. What'd you come up with? If it's a number greater than 2, I'll be shocked. All right. For those of you out there who are like super nerdy and you've got like a NAS or like, a gaming PC with that, you have like one of those transmission optimized Ethernet cards. Okay, I'll give you that. But most people do not have anything plugged into Ethernet anymore anyway. When you think about the way that we consume our content now, it is done with a tablet or a mobile phone or a laptop or a streaming device that's plugged into our computer. Nobody wants to string Ethernet cables across their house for that. I had to plug my printer into an Ethernet cable, and it annoyed me because the wireless card kept flaking out in it, because turns out infrastructure Wi-Fi devices are not exactly the best performing Wi-Fi devices. So we've killed Ethernet effectively. Why do we need to put out a press release about how we're killing Ethernet? Well, because it turns out the MediaTek actually is going to kill Ethernet, just not the way you're thinking. Because guess what? Those brand new Wi-Fi 7 access points that have this miraculously amazing throughput are going to kill the Ethernet. in your cable plant. In a recent presentation that we got from Juniper Networks at Networking Field Day 27, which we'll also link up here and in the show notes, Wes Purvis, who's one of those really smart AP guys, told me that there's this discussion that's been brewing in the Wi-Fi industry for a long time about, do we need multi-gig Ethernet connections, which is more than 1 gigabit per second, but not to 10 gigabits per second. There's a standard that gets you to about 2.5. And he said, yes, in very specific scenarios, which is effectively where the access point is running at full tilt boogie and completely overwhelming a single gigabit connection. Also, if you need more power to run some of the advanced features on the new access point, which is a new power standard, 802.3bt, which will probably get a really cool, classy name that nobody cares about anyway, because we've done that a lot with Wi-Fi. But anyway, yes, you're going to need to run new cables. You're going to need to have new switches because the current switches you have probably don't support this MGig unless you bought something really recently. And yeah, you're going to need to redo your Ethernet for the access point that's supposed to kill Ethernet. Yeah, we already took care of that. But why would you need that much Ethernet capacity anyway? What exactly are you doing on these access points that requires a ridiculous amount of bandwidth? Well, first of all, let's attack that number that I quoted earlier. 40 gigabits per second sounds pretty awesome. You're right. How about 10 gigabits per second? That sounds pretty awesome too, right? Well, let's say 9.8 gigabits per second. That's a fast connection. Do you know what that is? That was the quoted rate for Wi-Fi 6 when it was theoretical. Oh, well, you're not getting the same kind of throughput that you're seeing on your existing Wi-Fi 6 AP? You mean the number that was quoted, the top speed, is not the cruising speed? Funny how that works, isn't it? Most reputable people will tell you that the average throughput of a Wi-Fi 6 radio today is probably about 1.5 to 1.6 gigabits per second. Still fast, still faster than a gigabit Ethernet connection that you probably have on your Soho switch, but not anywhere near the 9.6 gigabits per second, 9.8 gigabits per second that was being quoted when this was a theoretical maximum. So, first things first, let's take that 40 gigabit per second number with a grain of salt. You know who else is taking it with a grain of salt? Pretty much everybody who's quoting it, because I've seen things that have gone from 30, which is what the IEEE is quoting, to 40, which is what the Wi-Fi Alliance and MediaTek are quoting, all the way up to like 46 gigabits per second, which is what Intel's quoting. And as much as I love Intel and as many engineers as they have, I don't believe that number at all. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, we'll cut it in maybe like a fourth. So at best, we'll see like 10 gigabits per second. Okay. What are you pushing that needs 10 gigabits per second? I'm actually legitimately curious, because unless you were doing things where you're moving files back and forth between a network attached storage device, or you're transferring large files between mobile devices or laptops, I can't actually think of what you need to be pushing that much data for. MediaTek's press release quoted things like 4K conference calls and 8K video streaming. All right, so I've been on a lot of conference calls recently. Most of us have, because, well, the pandemic. How many of those people do you think are streaming in 4K? How many webcams do you think people bought that stream in 4K? It wasn't until recently that you could even get a laptop from Apple that had a webcam capable of streaming in 1080p. That's HD. That's so 2000 and not now. 4K is where it's at. Yeah. Do you know what happened when standard broadcast television went from using what was considered standard definition of 480i up to 1080p? Makeup budgets tripled, because it turns out that when you're streaming in high def, people can see everything. And so they actually had to do a lot more cover up. So now you're wanting to quadruple the amount of pixels in that picture. Oh, hey, guess how much bandwidth you're going to be pushing now that you're streaming in 4K for really no good reason. I can't think of a single reason why anyone would need to stream anything in 8K. If you you're a video streamer, you're streaming yourself playing video games. They're not in 8K. That's about the only thing I can think of. Oh, well, what's your internet connection? Now we're starting to get into a little bit of a problem here. So the ubiquity of internet connections is actually going to be the limiting factor on all of these speeds, because it doesn't matter how fast your Wi-Fi goes when you're at home, how fast your client connects to your access point. If the majority of your traffic goes to the internet and your internet connection is, I don't know, 500 megabits per second, it doesn't matter. You can get away with a much slower Wi-Fi connection. Oh, you want to get a gigabit Ethernet connection to your house? You can do that. You're going to pay for it. And even then, it's gigabit down. Upstream, which is what you would use for video conferencing and streaming, very much not anywhere close to that gigabit. It's a very asymmetrical connection. In fact, a lot of providers don't even quote that number anymore because they don't care, because everyone wants to consume Netflix. Okay, so let's say that you are going to you're going to invest in these new Wi-Fi 7 APs, which you can't really find any because nobody's selling them. You're going to invest in new Wi-Fi 7 client devices, which again, you can't find anybody because nobody's selling them. How are you going to get them hooked up to your existing devices? Oh, that's right. If you can find one, it'll probably be a card that plugs into your laptop. You're not going to be able to get Wi-Fi 7 on your tablet or your phone or your streaming box because the technology doesn't exist yet to have those integrated into those devices. And here's the other thing you got to know. So and I'll use this as an example because these are the devices that I use, but an Apple MacBook has support for a large number of spatial streams, a large number of transmission bandwidths. How many of you use an iPad as your primary computing device when you're not at work? I know a lot of people that do. My parents do. Those things are limited. They don't have nearly the amount of processing and power to do things like spatial streams. In fact, it wasn't all that long ago that iPads and iPhones were limited to a single spatial stream. Yeah, you want to go from 16 lanes of that highway down to one? It doesn't matter how much power you pump at it. It's never going to go faster than a certain rate. And remember that a lot of these Wi-Fi radios in tablets and phones are not optimized for throughput. They're optimized for battery life. Yeah, it's great to get you off of the local radio network, the 5G, whatever you're running. But the odds are really good that the radio that you're getting onto is as fast or a little bit slower because it's not optimized to go full out. It is optimized to sip battery life. And so they're configured in such a way. All right. So I think I've pretty much shot the argument about Wi-Fi 7 completely out of the water. Here's what you need to do. First of all, ignore any press releases that are coming out that say anything about how Wi-Fi 7 is the greatest technology ever and you need to wait. Because the people who put out those press releases are probably the ones who are trying to sell you the equipment. You have no reason to put off any plans to upgrade any devices today or for the rest of this year if you're waiting for Wi-Fi 7. You need to do the upgrade now. You need to upgrade it to Wi-Fi 6 at a minimum. If you have a need for speed, you should look at upgrading to Wi-Fi 6E. But that's going to narrow your client devices because you have to get ones that either have support for 6E or that can add support for 6E, which means you're not going to be able to use it with any kind of a mobile device that has no ability to put add-on cards. You're going to be using it with laptops and desktops for the most part. Wi-Fi 7 will likely not be ratified on schedule. If we use Wi-Fi 6 as the roadmap, I bet you we will not see Wi-Fi 7 ratified before 2026. Vendors are going to play a game where they want their features to be included. They want to be able to position themselves as the fastest or the first or the best or whatever it takes to be at the top of somebody's list. So I would not expect a final draft of that for 2026. Well, if you do the math, that's 4 years away right now as of recording this video, at least. How many of you guys out there refresh your technology at least every 4 years, if not before? It depends. Some people will use a laptop until it falls apart. Most people want to get a new phone every year. Yeah. What we're looking at right now is the very good likelihood that the devices you have right now don't support the current technology. If you're looking to deploy the current technology, you need to do it now because by the time the next revision of this technology is released, we're going to be in a new refresh cycle where we're going to have to get new switches anyway. We're going to have to rerun our cable plant, probably. We are going to have to get new client devices because by that point we'll be on what the Apple M4, M5, whatever it is at that time, and it should have support. Hopefully by that point for Wi-Fi 6E. But we'll look at the adoption of that technology. But more importantly, don't base your technology buying decisions on whether or not a device has the latest cutting edge technology that you can't use. For those of you out there who are saying, well, I'm not going to buy the brand new MacBook Pro because it doesn't have support for 6 GHz wireless, you can do that yourself. I think you were just really trying to find an excuse to not spend that much money on a brand new laptop. But for those of you out there who are thinking, well, I'm going to wait and I'm not going to buy anything until Wi-Fi 7 is released, you're going to be very frustrated by the time that really happens. Don't wait for Wi-Fi 7. Make the decisions you need to make now and let the market settle itself out before you're ready to buy something. Because I promise you, if nothing else in this video that I've said convinces you, I highly doubt that MediaTek is going to matter very much at all when Wi-Fi 7 is finally released. Thank you very much for tuning in for this episode. I hope that it was a little bit enlightening for me to give you the rundown specs of Wi-Fi 7, but also all of the reasons why I don't think this is going to be a big deal today or for the rest of this year. There are a lot of great episodes of Tomversations on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/GestaltIT Also, you can check out the show notes and some of the links to the research that I've done for these episodes if you head over to our website at gestaltit.com. You can also find more writing, coverage of events and briefings that we've taken on our video page. You can also see our checksum videos. You can see our unboxing videos. You can see some of our podcast episodes. We do a lot of work to bring you some of the great information about enterprise IT, and we really appreciate it. And if you want to subscribe to this channel, you can be notified by hitting the little bell icon every time we publish a new video. You can subscribe to some of the sub playlists that we have, like Tomversations or Checksum, or the rundown that we publish every week. We would very much appreciate it. And, if you have any thoughts on Wi-Fi 7, if you think that it's going to be a game-changing technology and that I just need to get on board, or if you think that I'm absolutely right and you're still running on Wi-Fi 4, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. And that, can help me understand maybe the reality of the usage patterns out there. Thank you for joining in for this episode of Tomversations. We will be back next month with another great topic, and we will see you then.